The year is 1943. The world is a furnace. In the skies over Central Europe, Allied bombers are dropping thousands of tons of explosives, turning industrial hubs into skeletal remains of twisted metal and ash. On the ground, the German army is locked in a titanic, frozen struggle on the Eastern Front, in a war of attrition that defies human imagination. At this exact moment on the other side of the Atlantic, Coca-Cola is the undisputed symbol of the American way of life. It is the bottled essence of home, of freedom, and of the brave young men fighting to preserve democracy. Every crate of Coke sent to the front lines is a morale booster, officially recognized by the United States government as an essential supply. General Eisenhower himself has ordered that every man in uniform should be able to get a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, no matter where they are or what it costs the company. But if you could somehow step through time and enter a dark, reinforced bunker in the heart of Berlin during that same year, you would witness a paradox that defies logic. On a table next to a map of a besieged city and a Luger pistol sits a glass bottle. It does not carry the iconic red and white script of Coca-Cola, but it is owned by the exact same corporate empire. It is called Fanta. How did a company from Atlanta, Georgia, manage to be the favorite beverage of both the American GI and the German officer at the exact same moment in history? To answer this, we must look past the sugar, the caffeine, and the bubbles. We must look at the cold, calculating machinery of global capitalism. We must talk about a man named Max Keith, a man who did not care about the color of a flag, only about the liquid gold flowing through his pipes. This is not just the story of a soda. It is the story of how a brand survived the most destructive war in history by playing both sides. To understand the birth of Fanta, we have to go back to the early 1930s. Germany was a broken nation, still reeling from the humiliation of the First World War and the crushing weight of the Great Depression. When the regime changed in 1933, the atmosphere in Berlin transformed overnight. A fierce, radical nationalism swept through the streets. For a foreign brand like Coca-Cola, this was a nightmare scenario. The new leadership was obsessed with self-sufficiency and purity. They viewed anything American as a threat to the German spirit. At the time, Coca-Cola Germany was a failing branch, struggling to find its footing in a hostile market. That was until Max Keith took the reins. Max Keith was not a soldier, but he possessed the discipline of a general and the soul of a conqueror. He realized that if Coca-Cola were to survive the rising tide of nationalism, it had to stop being an American product. It had to become more German than beer. Keith launched a campaign of what he called industrial patriotism. He ensured that every bottle cap was stamped with the words, "Made in Germany." He hired thousands of local workers and made sure the company was seen at every major national event. He didn't just want to sell a drink. He wanted to weave Coca-Cola into the very fabric of the new German society. The ultimate test of this strategy came during the 1936 Berlin Olympics. While the world watched the regime use the games as a massive propaganda stage, Max Keith saw a marketing goldmine. Coca-Cola became one of the primary sponsors of the games. As the athletes competed under the shadow of massive banners and symbols of power, the red and white logo of Coca-Cola was everywhere. It was a deal with the devil. Keith wasn't necessarily a believer in the ideology of the time, but he was a believer in the market. He knew that the regime valued strength, modernization, and efficiency, the very things Coca-Cola represented. By the end of the 1930s, Germany had become the company's most successful market outside of the United States, selling millions of cases every year. But the golden era of expansion was about to hit a wall of fire. In September 1939, the invasion of Poland sparked a global conflagration. At first, Max Keith managed to keep the factories running by using existing stockpiles of the secret flavoring syrup. But the real crisis arrived in December 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States officially entered the war and declared a total trade embargo on the Axis powers. Suddenly, the supply of the most guarded secret in the world, the merchandise 7X flavoring syrup, was cut off. Without that syrup, you cannot make Coca-Cola. You only have carbonated water and sugar. Max Keith was now the head of a massive industrial empire with nothing to produce. He knew that if his factories stopped breathing, the state would breathe for them. In a wartime economy, an idle factory is a wasted resource. The government would have seized the buildings, drafted the workers into the army, and melted the machinery down into shells and casings. Keith was desperate. He gathered his top chemists in a secret laboratory and gave them a mandate that sounded like alchemy. He told them to create a new drink from the scraps of a nation at war. The resources in Germany were dwindling. There were no oranges, no lemons, and no exotic oils. The chemists were forced to look at the waste products of other industries. They looked at the dairy industry and found whey, the thin, yellowish liquid left over from the cheese-making process. They looked at the fruit industry and found apple pomace, the crushed remains of skins and cores left over from cider presses. They took these industrial leftovers, mixed them with saccharine and whatever beet sugar they could find, and carbonated the mixture. The result was a drink that was beige, cloudy, and tasted nothing like the Fanta we know today. It had a sharp, fermented apple flavor with a strange, milky aftertaste. When it came time to name this creation, Keith held a brainstorming session with his executives. He told them to let their imaginations run wild, to use their fantasy. One of his lead salesmen immediately shouted the name that would stick: Fanta. It was a stroke of genius. It was short, it was energetic, and it felt domestic. Fanta hit the shelves in 1941, and it didn't just sell, it became a phenomenon. But the reason for its success was grim. As the war intensified, food became scarce. Sugar was a luxury that few could afford. German housewives discovered that Fanta, with its high sugar content and fruit base, was the perfect substitute for baking and cooking. They used it to sweeten cakes and flavor soups. Fanta wasn't just a soda anymore, it was a staple of the wartime kitchen. While the world burned, Max Keith sat in his office in occupied Europe, managing a sprawling network of factories that were technically owned by an American company, yet serving the needs of its greatest enemy. In Atlanta, the headquarters of Coca-Cola officially claimed they had lost contact with the German branch. But historical records suggest that through neutral countries like Switzerland, the lines of communication never truly went cold. The corporation was performing a perfect hedge. In America, they were the ultimate patriots, fueling the Allied war effort. In Europe, they were the resilient survivors, keeping the machinery ready for the day the smoke cleared. As the end drew near in 1945, and the leaders of the regime began to disappear into bunkers, Keith stayed at his post. When American soldiers finally reached the industrial sectors of Berlin, they expected to find scorched earth. Instead, they found Max Keith standing in a perfectly organized factory. He presented them with a meticulous accounting of every bottle of Fanta sold and every piece of equipment preserved. He had even hidden a small stockpile of real Coca-Cola syrup for years, waiting for this moment. He offered the American officers a drink. It was a masterclass in corporate survival. Max Keith was not charged with treason. Instead, he was hailed as a hero who had protected American assets behind enemy lines. Coca-Cola promoted him to head of Coca-Cola Europe. Fanta was not killed off. It was eventually rebranded in Italy in the 1950s with the orange flavor we recognize today. Today, Fanta is the second largest brand in the company's portfolio. The story of Fanta serves as a haunting lesson in the morality of global capitalism. It reminds us that while ideologies clash and millions die on the battlefield, the machinery of business operates on a different plane of existence. A corporation has no soul, no country, and no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. Max Keith didn't save a drink. He saved a profit margin. He ensured that regardless of who won the war, the company would be ready to bottle the peace. So, the next time you hear the hiss of a cold soda bottle opening, remember the beige, cloudy liquid born from the scraps of a broken empire. Remember that behind the bright colors and the neons of modern branding, there are often shadows that the world has forgotten. Flags change, borders move, and regimes fall. But the market always finds a way to survive. Thank you for watching.